Talk to us about fungi.
There are all kinds of fungi, right? But I think that my favorite ones to talk about are the powdery mildews and the necrotrophs, the like botrytis and things like that. I like to bring these up because they represent two different pathways to colonizing plants. Powdery mildews are what we call biotrophs, so they require a living host to feed on. One interesting thing about powdery mildew, which you heard me talk about at the Soil Summit, was that powdery mildews, if you go back far enough, they're related to fungi that broke down plant tissues. So they have the same genes that they use to break down the cellulose in plant cells. So perhaps they evolved from these fungi that used to break down decaying plant matter, and they became really good at breaking down living plant matter instead. So they became parasites. And I think that's really interesting when it comes to the soil food web and that kind of thing, where what could be a beneficial can eventually become a parasite given enough time and familiarity with the host, so to speak. And powdery mildews, they are not systemic. Some people think they're a systemic pathogen, but things like botrytis are, or fusarium are, whereas powdery mildew only exists on the epidermis of the plant. So only kind of like skin deep, but they're really good at colonizing the plant once they've established. So when you see different spots colonize, it's not because they're moving through the tissue, it's because they're recolonizing the host. And powdery mildews are not super detrimental to their plant host typically, whereas things like botrytis, they get onto the plant, they trick the plant to kill itself. It tricks the cells to destroy themselves, and they sop up the nutrients afterwards. So they're a real threat, and they can attack different parts of the plant. Botrytis, for example, is commonly associated with the flower, right? With the rotting of floral tissue in particular. But you also get things like fusarium that will attack things like the roots or the stem. And sometimes you have plants where everything looked fine, but then like a few days later, it suddenly starts to wilt. You don't know what's going on. You check the roots and you see that there's all kinds of like oozing, tissue and dilapidated structures. And it's because this fungus attacks the tissue and like immediately destroys the roots. And once the roots are gone, there's really not very much for the plant. Or if the stem is really damaged, then there's not a lot of nutrient transfer. It dies very quickly. So you gotta know these two different kinds of fungi. Some of them are not a huge deal. Some of them are a huge deal, and they can be a quick problem. So having a plan, knowing that those things are even possible, and then having something that you can apply beforehand, like a microbe or a compound or something like that. And also just keeping your plants hygienic is also really helpful. Maybe chopping and dropping is not always the greatest when it comes to these pathogens that can be on or in the tissues. Or if you are going to do something like that, like compost it, process it, and then reapply it.
I had bud rot before. When you mentioned that, it just brought up memories, bad memories, of course. Botrytis cinerea had that. I actually had indoors, the oscillating fan died overnight. And so there was just that stagnant air, humidity rose, right? It ended up attacking 4 of my plants. If I remember correctly, 4 of the plants had botrytis in it, bud rot. And it was just really in the main cola. So these are plants where I had really huge buds, and it was really just this main cola that kind of stuck up more. There was bud rot right in the middle because of it. And a lot of people was kind of surprised because, obviously I corrected the problem, right? So this was latent flowering when the fan died. I corrected the problem within, I think, 24 to 48 hours, right? But correct me if I'm wrong, that is enough time in order for it to kind of establish from there. And then I spent 2 more weeks growing the plants. Well, that doesn't mean that since I have air circulation now that it's just going to stop growing, right? So it'll continue to spread, right? So I get to harvest and then realize, oh my gosh, I had bud rot. It must have been from when my fan died 2 weeks ago. So that wasn't fun. Now, I was able to still utilize the bottom buds that didn't have bud rot. And I know some people are against that. They say, hey, you got bud rot in one part of the plant, throw away the entire plant. Other people are going to say, hey, just cut off that bud that's impacted. The rest of the plant is fine. What's your take on that?
Yeah, that's a good question because it is systemic, like I said. I think that if you're seeing, like if you don't see the colonization of the tissues itself, so now you can't necessarily see some of these things because they're microscopic, right? So I think that having a cautious approach is definitely valid. Certainly, you could do something like that. Generally, though, I think at the very least, like not necessarily at a home grow perspective when you're growing plants by yourselves, like even if you have like produce, like botrytis will colonize the fruit tissue or the floral tissue. Like maybe discard the orange that has the fungus, but maybe don't necessarily discard the orange or the fruit that has no signs of mycosis, essentially. But if you got like that moldy development, that farinaceous odor, maybe cut that part out. Don't try your luck with that one. I think that's totally valid. But from a commercial level, you might be looking at different things. You might be able to perceive through testing and other things if there is other stuff that you don't want people to be exposed to as well. So it definitely makes sense to be cautious. And I think that also one other thing I'd like to say is that bud rot doesn't necessarily only colonize the floral tissue, and in some cases, in some plants, it can be a foliar pathogen or even a stem or a root pathogen.
I don't wish bud rot upon anyone. It is not fun at all. It's the feeling of going all the way to the point where you're ready to harvest and then realizing that you've got bud rot. It's just a feeling that I don't want anybody to have.
Such a waste. It just feels so bad. I totally agree with that.
This clip is brought to you by AC Infinity. Use discount code MrGrow at 15 to save on any of their products.